The list of policies broadly supported by Massachusetts residents but imperiled by a second Trump administration is almost too long to count. We at Commonwealth Beacon and our peers at other organizations are going to be breaking down the implications for things like education, voting rights, medical care, you name it, as we get closer and closer to the new administration. But what we're here to talk about today is abortion. I'm Jennifer Smith, and this is the Codcast, Commonwealth Beacon's podcast about policy and civic life here in Massachusetts. Today, I'm joined by Reproductive Equity Now President Rebecca Hart Holder. Rebecca, good to see you.
Thank you so much for having me.
So, first things first, we're talking about reproductive care access as though it's a thing that should plausibly be protected. And that's because here in Massachusetts, polling consistently shows high levels of support for maintaining access to abortion services, whether that be medication or surgical. But we should, of course, note here that there are plenty of people who maintain a moral or religious objection to the practice. So, that is the aside. That's the positioning that we're in right now. Rebecca, this is now Massachusetts' second go-round under a Trump administration. What do we know now that we didn't in 2016?
That is such a great question. First of all, we have done a huge amount of work during the first Trump administration to prepare ourselves for what a hostile federal government looks like. So we've codified the right to abortion in state law, and we have taken really profound and important steps to increase access here in Massachusetts. Of course, that work is not done. There is more work that we will need to do, but from a sort of table setting perspective, we have made sure that people can access care here. One of the really important things that we did, what I would be remiss not to talk about, is making budgetary investments in the ability of people to actually access care. Money can often be a huge barrier, and the legislature devoted $2 million to make sure that people could get care here. So we've set the table, but there is going to be a huge amount of work to do in a second Trump administration.
Help me out a little bit with one of the things that comes up whenever you're talking about any of the policies that could be imperiled by or affected by a second Trump administration, which is the question of, well, is it just going to be a repeat of last time? Is there going to be sort of forward movement from, for instance, drawing from the Project 2025 information or statements that have been made during this campaign cycle? Or do we assume that, it'll just kind of end up getting fought out in the courts and it'll end up being a state-by-state whack-a-mole? How have you approached basically trying to think, how bad could it get? How bad will it probably get? And then what's the best case scenario?
I'm not planning for best case scenarios right now, and I don't think we are living in a best case scenario world. What the Trump campaign did in connection with the Heritage Foundation was to give us their game plan with Project 2025. We understand what it is they want to do. They want a federal abortion ban. It is not sufficient to have overturned Roe because that does not control access in all 50 states. They want to ban abortion everywhere, not just in I think it's 21 states that have banned abortion since the Dobbs decision. We know that they want to use the Comstock Act, which is an archaic law from the 1870s that has never been used to stop access to abortion. Their plan is to resurrect it, to prohibit the mailing of medication abortion, and even possibly the devices that are used to provide surgical abortion. We know that they want to try and strip authorization of mifepristone, one of two drugs in the medication abortion regime, through the FDA. They've made their threats very clear. I think the sort of icing on top of the cake for us is a very hostile Supreme Court. In the first Trump administration, President Trump nominated several extremely anti-abortion justices whose nomination resulted in the Dobbs decision. So we have a Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, that is not going to protect the right to choose, and they have not made a secret of that. So the work is certainly in the states, and I think one thing we should be prepared for is that Massachusetts and the other states that have passed telehealth shield law for providers who are mailing pills across state lines, we know that the incoming Trump administration is already being pushed by anti-abortion advocates to try to make that much more difficult. So, we know that they are going to use blue states to decrease access in red states.
So if we could dig in a little bit on the Shield Law access side of things here, because one of the reasons we're talking today is about whether or not Massachusetts has the capacity to handle it if more and more people come to the state for abortion. But of course, many people do take advantage of telehealth medicine. We are in 2024. We've made it through a pandemic. There are ways to talk to doctors, even if you are not in the state where the doctor is. So walk me through a little bit the state Shield Law, and in case our listeners aren't familiar, why do we have it? What does it do?
Let me back up a little bit by saying that the Mass Department of Public Health recently released its numbers for abortion access in 2023, and we saw a 37% increase in people traveling from other states to Massachusetts for care. We have heard from providers that this includes people traveling from Texas, from the Dakotas, from all across the southern United States. People come here because maybe they grew up here or they went to school here. Maybe their best friend lives here. So we are not immune to people having to travel. That is also incredibly costly. It's hard to get time off work. It's hard to find childcare for your children if you need abortion access. It's just simply not tenable for most people, and it's often not covered by insurance. So we understood when Dobbs happened that part of the solution to decreasing the need to travel and increasing abortion access would be mailing medication across state lines. We also started hearing pretty quickly after the Dobbs decision was leaked from providers saying, how is the state going to protect me? How am I going to provide care to patients? And what will the state do? And from that, we worked with then AG Healy's office and the ACLU, as well as several state legislators, including Senator Cindy Friedman, to really innovate, right? Knowing that our providers believe that abortion care is a human right, knowing that there was an appetite to mail medication abortion across state lines. How could we create a law that would protect providers? Some of the things we were most worried about was extradition. So if the state of Texas, for example, issued a warrant for a provider in Massachusetts to be extradited to Texas because that person mailed medication abortion pills to Texas, what would the state do? How would the state react? The Shield Law contemplates those types of questions. And it says that in the instance of abortion care and gender-affirming care, the state will proactively protect providers and not cooperate with those out-of-state actions. It is a really important stance that, I am very proud that the legislature and the Attorney General were so bold in how they were thinking about how do we get out in front of the threats that we know are coming and make it so we can increase access. And I do want to say that the number of abortions each month is very high. It has not decreased since Dobbs, and that is because we are mailing medication abortion pills, and a disproportionate number are coming from our incredibly heroic and brave providers in Massachusetts.
On that subject, thinking about that 37% spike year over year, a lot of the questions around the first Trump administration and then specifically after Roe fell was, can Massachusetts literally, physically, financially handle this increased strain? What have we seen?
So far, the answer is yes. We are lucky to live in a state with some of the best healthcare in the world, and we have been able to accommodate patients traveling. If that continues to increase, I think we need to take a hard look and continually be talking to independent providers, to Planned Parenthood, to the hospitals who are providing care later in pregnancy to make sure that they can continue to handle it. But the legislature has shown an appetite to help fund those providers, so I feel really confident that that will continue.
I think one interesting polling factor to note here was last year, a Commonwealth Beacon poll that the MassInc polling group did found that 72% of respondents actually did support healthcare providers in the state providing abortion services to people from out of state. So Obviously, that is not 100%. That still means, about a third of the state, a little bit less than a third of the state, doesn't feel like that's something that we should be doing. But when you think about the pretty consistent amount of support from residents when asked not just should it be available to people in Massachusetts, but should Massachusetts have that sort of provider role almost for other states, do you think that that's going to evolve? Do you think it's going to remain consistent? If we start to see strains, do you worry that there might be an erosion of support?
I don't. The providers that are offering telehealth care right now are focused on telehealth. There are a separate set of providers who are focused on in-clinic care, whether that is medication, abortion, or surgical. So I don't think that strain will come from mailing medication abortion across state lines. If there is strain, and I'm not convinced that there would be immediately, but if there is, I think it would come from travel. I think the really important thing to remember is the majority of Bay Staters know that people are going to get abortion care whether it is legal or not. It happened pre-Roe, it is happening post-Roe, and the majority of Bay Staters support the fact that our providers are, quite frankly, fearless in trying to make sure that everyone across the country can get the care that they need.
And how are you processing these days the language that's been used by Trump during the campaign, but also plenty of Republicans since, saying that it is essentially a leave it to the states approach that they've been taking post-Roe? Because we've talked before about, for instance, if it's illegal to mail or ship abortion medication or any tools or anything like that, then that does implicate even states where it is legal. It doesn't seem like it's quite accurate to say, do your own thing, Massachusetts.
Yeah, I don't believe them for 1 second. I mean, the goal, like I said, is a federal abortion ban. Leave it to the states is a nice talking point from Justice Alito. If we're to leave it to the states, which I don't believe we should, I believe that there should be a national right to abortion. But if we're really going to leave it to the states, then they should leave Massachusetts alone and let us do the important work that we need to do to protect access to care.
So, one of the other tools here is money. We've talked about the investments on the state level, about shoring up access to abortion options, but a Republican administration could theoretically withhold federal funding to clinics or hospitals that provide abortion. How are you monitoring that sort of financial threat?
That's a very good point. I mean, we will be watching very closely what the Trump administration does with federal funding for hospitals, with Title X funding, which provides funding to the states for family planning. It's a real concern. And it certainly is a place where if the Trump administration or when the Trump administration pulls money back from family planning, we will be looking to the state to step up and try to fill those gaps.
And speaking of the courts, which we've touched on a few times here, what are you watching as different state courts around the country sort of try to deal with whether or not the, in some cases, really long-standing abortion bans that had been sort of put on hold by Roe being law of the land go back into action? We've seen a lot of challenges to those sort of existing bans, some efforts to rewrite constitutions from even red states. So where are the courts in all of this, in your viewpoint?
There are many states, as you know, that elect the highest judges in their state. I don't think that the pro-repro movement has done a good enough job of paying attention to the importance of electing judges who believe in the right to choose. That's a place where I see a lot of state orgs refocusing their work. Obviously, that's not something we do here in Massachusetts, so we instead really look to the executive branch to make nominations rather to the court of jurists who we believe will uphold the right to choose. But it is a place where our movement needs to spend a considerable amount of time. When you look at states like Missouri and Ohio, which have amended the Constitution in order to, protect the right to choose, what you're really going to see following those really exciting elections is implementation struggles. And it's really going to matter who sits on the court around the interpretation of the voters' will and to make sure that enactment of the right to choose in their state constitutions actually comes to fruition.
And we should note that part of the reason that this conversation is so fraught is that it's tied to a lot of other rights that people sort of take for granted. One of the ones right now that there's been a lot of bubbling around is, well, are there implications for contraceptives to begin with here, especially depending on how you're categorizing whether or not it's accurate. But there are plenty of folks who categorize, for instance, a Plan B pill or a pill contraceptive as akin enough to an abortion, at least in that framework, in that mental and moral framework, that there are going to be additional challenges to that, it looks likely.
The place that we have to start from is that anti-abortion advocates do not want women to be able to control if, when, and how they become pregnant. When we take that as truth, it is then evident that abortion is not the end game. They are also trying to prevent us from having access to contraception. We saw that in Louisiana immediately after Dobbs. The legislature of Louisiana tried to ban certain forms of contraception. We saw that in the first Trump administration when Mr. Trump went after the ACA's contraceptive coverage mandate. Now, that's, of course, not a ban, but making it financially impossible to access birth control can function as a ban in many people's lives. So I think we have to be very, very clear-eyed about the fact that the end game is not abortion. The end game goes far beyond abortion. It is actually about women's position in society. And the way you prevent women from being equal is preventing them from controlling their reproductive destiny.
And so what's the messaging that you've found as you've looked across the country, as you've looked at a number of measures that have been successful in states of all sort of political denominations? What is the messaging that you've found to be most effective when there were either efforts to shore up state-specific abortion protections or in trying to combat misinformation coming from a state government?
There are a couple that have been really effective. I mean, one is that people, whether you're in a red, blue, or purple state, they fundamentally don't want politicians in the exam room with them. People have complicated decisions to make around trying to get pregnant, around preventing pregnancy, and around the pregnancy itself when they are trying to have a child. No politician belongs in those conversations, contrary to what Dr. Oz has said on the campaign trail. And that really resonates. You saw that in Missouri. You saw that in Kansas. You saw that in Kentucky. You even saw that with 57% of people in Florida, an overwhelming number of people who want the state constitution to reflect the fundamental belief that the majority of Americans have, that this is not the business of politicians. Another really effective communication tool for our movement has been that this is a moment for states to take back power, that the federal government has proven that it is not capable of protecting our right to contraception, our right to abortion, our right to IVF, our right to paid family medical leave when we start a family. And so this is the moment when the states step up, and that's becoming true in red states as well. So I think it's really important that, we sort of unilaterally keep making the point that the states are at the front line trying to protect people. We cannot give up on any state. Massachusetts is, way ahead of our counterparts in Missouri, but Missouri is making progress on that issue slowly, but making progress nevertheless.
Can I ask very quickly, because you mentioned Dr. Oz, what your reaction has been to the unusual bunch of nominations that we've seen rolling out specifically around healthcare spaces?
President Trump is a bully, and he is trying to see how far he can push the Senate with his nominations. He is trying to see if the Matt Gaetzes of the world can make it through. And he's trying to figure out how quickly the Senate is going to fold. I wish I could say I was surprised. I am outraged. I'm not surprised. It is very, very dangerous to the health of our country to contemplate, RFK Jr. at HHS, Dr. Oz at CMS, and Matt Gaetz at DOJ. I can't really believe that, but I really hope that the Senate, and particularly the Republicans in the Senate, stand up for what they know is right.
One thing that also comes to mind is there are implications here on education policy. So the state here in Massachusetts, we updated our health guidelines for the first time in like 20 years or something. But several things in those new guidelines are targets of the Trump administration, the Project 2025 agenda, as pretty clearly stated, notably sex ed teaching and also age-appropriate gender identity conversations sort of come to mind. So how are you thinking about not just whether there is access to the care options themselves, but how you even learn about them?
Listen, it's really clear that the data shows that if you teach young people about healthy sexual relationships, about consent, about how you say no, about how you protect yourself if you become sexually active, then you will not only decrease the number of unintended pregnancies, but you will have a lot of people who feel empowered to make the decision that's right for them about when to become sexually active. We need to teach young people about consent. That is incredibly important. And quite frankly, there is no scientific evidence that suggests that age appropriate, and I stress here, age appropriate sexuality education increases sexual activity. In fact, it has the opposite effect. It empowers young people to make the decisions that are right for them. So I am really concerned about what the impact of the Trump administration will be on sexuality education. Again, I'm really grateful that we have a governor who so proactively, took steps to update our sexuality curriculum here in the Commonwealth, but it is something we should be really clear-eyed will be tied to an increase in unintended pregnancies in other states if the Trump administration has its way.
Does it feel like you're stretched resource-wise? I think the thing that's been so interesting in sort of trying to get a sense of all of the ways that reproductive care access could be impacted by a second Trump administration is that it's kind of from every possible angle. And I wonder if that's also what it feels like from inside the advocacy community.
Yeah, I feel pretty stretched. I think we know and have been looking very closely at the Project 2025 playbook, but they are thinking about interventions that they have not made public yet. And we do not know what they are, and we don't know when they will be coming, and it will require us to react quickly and to take, steps that we hadn't contemplated before. We will do it because we have shown that we will always show up, but this is a marathon, and at this point, I think it's actually like an ultra marathon. And, I think advocates are tired, but we are also very determined, and we are going to continue to fight back.
Thanks again to Rebecca Hart Holder for joining me on the Codcast. Thank you for listening. I'm Jennifer Smith. Our producer is Claire Wigglesworth. Leave a rating and review wherever you're hearing this now if you want to help other folks find us, and email codcast@commonwealthbeacon.org if you ever want to get in touch directly. Have a lovely Thanksgiving. We'll be back next week.